Tonight we step back through time, into a place where chalk dust hangs in the air like low fog and the creak of wooden desks sets the rhythm of the day. The air smells faintly of old wood, coal smoke, and something metallic, iron, perhaps, or the quiet promise of ink. You find yourself standing in the doorway of a Victorian classroom, and you can almost feel the weight of discipline pressing down before you've even taken a seat. Every child's back is straight, every quill is still. The only motion comes from a stern schoolmaster whose spectacles catch the light like tiny moons. You probably won't survive this without earning at least one smudge of ink on your cuff. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The benches are narrow and polished smooth by generations of nervous elbows. You sit, careful not to make a sound, though the wood creaks a quiet protest beneath you. A tall clock ticks from the wall, each second sounding as if it's measuring not time but obedience. Outside, fog presses against the window panes, and the faint call of a street vendor selling roasted chestnuts reminds you there's a world beyond these chalk-lined walls. The master clears his throat, a thunderous sound that makes everyone sit straighter. He announces today's lesson, ink. The word itself seems heavy, thick with mystery. You'd expected geography or maybe handwriting drills, but instead, he tells you that no scholar can understand the world without first understanding what carries the words that describe it. The class leans forward, sensing that something important, maybe even sacred, is about to happen. He begins by describing how ink has existed for thousands of years. The ancient Egyptians used soot and gum. The Chinese, he explains, made theirs from lampblack and pine resin long before the Victorians had even learned to boil water properly. A boy in the front row dares to snicker, and immediately the master's ruler lands on the desk beside him like a lightning strike. The sound echoes. No one laughs again. You glance around the room, taking in the details, the ink-stained fingers, the faint scratches on the wooden desks where generations have carved their initials in quiet rebellion. The smell of candle wax mingles with the faint tang of vinegar from the jar at the master's table. There's something strangely soothing in this order, in the way every object has its purpose. Even the silence feels polished. He explains that today's ink-making lesson is both scientific and moral. Ink, he declares, is civilization bottled. You think about that, how every treaty, confession, and love letter has been carried on its dark waves. Historians still argue whether Victorian ink was truly superior to that of earlier centuries, but your master will hear none of it. For him, progress is measured by the depth of blackness on the page. You're handed a small scrap of parchment, rougher than paper, and a feather quill. The boy next to you whispers that it once belonged to a goose with better handwriting than half the class. You stifle a laugh, but it slips out anyway, earning a quick glare. There's something about the tension here that makes humor feel like rebellion, tiny sparks in a room full of rules. At the front of the room, jars are lined up like tiny soldiers, oak galls, gum arabic, and something that looks suspiciously like soot. The master begins the demonstration with a measured grace, his every movement deliberate. He explains that oak galls are small growths formed when wasps lay their eggs on oak leaves, nature's own blemishes turned into beauty. You suppress a shiver. The idea of grinding up insect homes for ink feels both fascinating and slightly tragic. He lifts one of the galls, hard and knobbly, and cracks it open to show its pale interior. Here lies potential, he says softly. The words hang in the air like incense. The class watches, entranced, as he measures the gall powder, adds a trickle of vinegar, and stares with a glass rod. The color begins to deepen, a transformation so subtle you'd almost miss it if you blinked. He calls it iron gall ink, the same kind that once filled the pens of clerks and poets alike. You imagine Charles Dickens hunched over his manuscript, the nib scratching furiously across the page as the ink dried to a permanent brown-black. There's a rumor, your friend at the back swears by it, that Dickens's manuscripts were so saturated with iron gall ink they can still corrode today. Whether it's true or not, the thought gives you goosebumps. The master continues his lecture, noting that ink, like character, takes time to develop. At first, it appears pale, nearly invisible, but exposure to air darkens it. Oxidation, he says. A small miracle of chemistry hidden in every sentence. You find yourself oddly comforted by this thought, that something invisible can, with patience, become permanent. As he moves around the room, his robes brush against your desk, trailing the faint scent of pipe tobacco. You catch a glimpse of his ink-stained cuffs and realize that even he is not immune to the mess he commands. The irony feels delicious, though you wouldn't dare say it out loud. Outside, rain begins to patter softly against the glass. The classroom, lit only by flickering oil lamps, seems to shrink into its own small universe, a world ruled by ink and order. You dip your quill into the practice pot, watching the dark liquid ripple like a tiny ocean. When you lift it out, a perfect bead of ink clings to the tip, trembling, ready to spill your thoughts onto the page. You hesitate, then write your name for the first time in true iron gall ink. The letters shine wetly for a moment, then darken, biting into the fibers of the paper. It feels like magic, the transformation from blankness to meaning, from silence to permanence. Somewhere behind you, a classmate's ink blot bursts into a small tragedy, and you hear a whispered curse quickly followed by a nervous giggle. The master pretends not to notice, though the corners of his mouth twitch ever so slightly. There's something deeply calming about the rhythm of the classroom, the scratch of quills, the ticking clock, the soft sighs of concentration. You find yourself swaying slightly, lulled by repetition and the scent of oak and soot. This is how knowledge feels, you think. Messy, patient, and unexpectedly beautiful. And as the lamp flame flickers lower, you realize that what you've begun tonight is not just a lesson in ink. It's a quiet initiation into the art of attention. Every drop of black carries centuries of craft, every stroke of the quill a conversation between past and present. The master's shadow stretches long across the floor as he strides between the rows of desks, boots clicking with a rhythm that feels almost military. His eyes, sharp as pen nibs, sweep over the class like a tide that misses nothing. You sit straighter, heart thumping softly, as he announces that before any ink can be made, every student must understand the command behind it, the discipline of materials, the ritual of craft. He stops by your desk and says your name, slow and deliberate. You can feel the weight of his voice sink into your shoulders. Ink, he tells you, is not simply black water. It is obedience liquefied. You nod as if you understand, though really, you're still thinking about how your fingers are sticky from the last exercise. He lifts a small cane, not to strike, but to point, toward the blackboard, where neat copperplate letters spell out a single phrase, order breeds clarity. Beneath it, someone has secretly scribbled a tiny caricature of the schoolmaster's nose. It's impressively accurate. He hasn't noticed yet, which gives you both terror and a guilty thrill. The class begins to murmur as he explains how ink making is to be treated like a scientific ritual. You, as his assistant for the day, will follow his every instruction. You feel an odd surge of pride, mixed with the awareness that failure could be public and loud. He dictates the first command, stand. The entire class rises like an army of nervous reeds. Hands on desks. You obey, palms flat against the wood worn smooth by generations of trembling fingers. He begins to pace again, his voice a slow metronome. The act of making ink requires control, steadiness, and the humility to know that stains are inevitable. You glance at your cuffs, already smudged, and wonder if humility can be taught or if it's just something you end up wearing. The master's own hands bear tiny scars from years of cutting quills and boiling ink. "We do not fear the blot," he says, "we master it." Somewhere in the back, a boy mutters, "You mean hide it." A few snickers bubble up. The master pauses, pivots, and fixes his gaze on the culprit. Silence crashes down like a curtain. You can practically hear the dust floating in the light. "Do you know," the master says softly, "that when monks in the Middle Ages copied manuscripts, they used to pray before touching the ink pot? Not out of piety, but terror. One blot could ruin a month's work." He lets the thought hang there like a bell note, then resumes pacing. You realize this classroom is his monastery, the ink pot, his altar. He launches into a tangent about how ink once decided fates. During the Victorian era, government clerks spent entire lives writing with iron gall ink, black lines that determined who paid taxes, who owned ships, who went to war. Empires, he declares, were drawn in ink before they were drawn in blood. Historians still argue whether that particular sentiment is metaphor or grim truth, but in this room, you wouldn't dare challenge it. The class begins to settle into the rhythm of the master's voice, the low hum of discipline taking root. You notice tiny details: the boy next to you chewing on his quill, the girl across the aisle counting each tick of the clock. The master's chalk squeaks briefly against the board as he diagrams the basic formula for ink: tannic acid from oak galls, ferrous sulfate from iron, gum arabic from acacia trees, and water. 4 humble ingredients that, when combined, become permanence itself. He glances at you. Ink is born from balance. Too much gall, and it bites the paper. Too little gum, and it fades like weak tea. You can't help it. You imagine an actual cup of gall tea and stifle a grin. A small joke slips out under your breath, a strong brew for strong words. To your surprise, the master almost smiles. "Indeed," he says, "though I'd not recommend it with biscuits." The class exhales in collective relief. A joke, sanctioned. It feels like a small miracle. He leads you to the teacher's desk, where jars await. "Every school," he says, "must make its own ink. It keeps the children honest." You're not entirely sure how, but you nod anyway. The desk is littered with relics: quills, pen knives, a paperweight shaped like an owl, and a small bottle labeled Essence of Patience. You suspect it's just water, but you admire the irony. You're instructed to take notes, your quill scratching slowly as you write: obedience, precision, purpose. The words feel heavier than they should. You notice a stain spreading under your hand and realize your ink is still wet. The smear turns the word purpose into a small thundercloud. The master glances over but says nothing, which somehow feels worse than being scolded. He begins telling stories now, his tone softening. He recalls a time, early in his teaching days, when he spilled an entire bottle of ink onto the headmaster's ledger. "It looked," he says dryly, "as though I'd murdered the alphabet." The class bursts into cautious laughter. He allows it, even seems to enjoy the sound. The moment humanizes him, one small blot in an otherwise perfect record. Outside, the bell of the nearby church tolls noon, its sound muffled through the glass. The master lowers his voice, becoming almost conspiratorial. "Ink, you see, is also deception. A drop of vinegar here, a measure of soot there, and suddenly, one can forge a signature, rewrite a will, alter a kingdom's decree." You feel the thrill of danger run through the room. Who knew ink could be such a trickster? He tells of forgers who used invisible ink made from lemon juice, words that only appeared when held to a flame. Historians still argue whether certain Victorian love letters were genuine or ghostwritten under candlelight. The thought makes you blush. though you pretend to study your parchment. You begin to sense the classroom as more than a place. It's a small theater where power, imagination, and fear share the stage. The master, with his perfect posture and weathered hands, is both priest and performer. And you, the student, are both audience and apprentice. As he concludes the day's lecture, he gestures toward the shelf of ingredients. Tomorrow, he says, you will mix. But tonight, you will dream of precision. You half expect him to wink. He doesn't. When the final bell rings, the sound seems to slice through the tension. Chairs scrape, boots shuffle, and the scent of ink and dust mingles in the air. You pack your things slowly, reluctant to break the spell. The master nods once, a rare gesture of approval, and you swear the faintest smile flickers beneath his mustache. As you step outside, the gray sky above the schoolhouse feels lighter somehow. You glance at your ink-stained fingers and realize that, for the first time, you understand what he meant: obedience liquefied. It's not about following rules, it's about learning to make something lasting from chaos. Morning arrives pale and brisk, with the kind of cold that nips at your fingertips before you've even left your bed. The school bell rings through the misty street like an iron reminder that comfort is temporary. You pull your cloak tighter, boots clicking over cobblestones slick with last night's drizzle. The classroom window glows dimly ahead, one square of golden warmth in a gray world. Inside, the day's lesson waits, gathering the ingredients for ink. When you step in, the room smells faintly of vinegar and ash. The desks glisten with a thin film of yesterday's polish, and sunlight spills through the tall, dust-hazed windows in perfect diagonal beams. The master is already there, sleeves rolled to his elbows, spectacles perched halfway down his nose. He looks more like an apothecary than a teacher this morning. Today, he declares, you will learn to source what civilization writes itself with. His tone suggests that this is not simply a craft, but a test of character. You take a deep breath, trying to remember everything from yesterday. 4 things: oak galls, soot, vinegar, gum arabic. And, apparently, courage. He hands you a small wooden basket, its handle worn smooth from use. Fetch the galls first, he says. From the cupboard. Top shelf. You cross the room, reaching for the heavy wooden door that guards the school's small trove of mystery. It creaks open like a secret being reluctantly shared. Inside are shelves lined with jars, each labeled in neat copper plate: soot, vinegar, saltpeter, gallnuts, finest quality. The last jar catches your eye. Its contents look like tiny, shriveled marbles. You twist open the lid, and the scent hits you, earthy, woody, with a faint note of decay. Those, says the master, appearing suddenly at your elbow, he has a habit of materializing at the most inconvenient times, are the bones of the oak's defense. You blink. Defense, sir? He nods, pleased to explain. Oak galls form when a wasp lays its egg in a leaf. The tree grows a hard shell around it, a prison of sorts. Once the wasp leaves, we grind what remains into powder. Nature's revenge becomes our ink. You stare at the little lumps, suddenly unsure if they're disgusting or miraculous. Probably both. A few classmates whisper, debating whether the galls still contain remnants of the wasp. Historians still argue whether Victorian teachers knew, or cared, about that detail. You decide not to ask. With your basket filled, you move to the soot jar. It looks ordinary enough, but when you lift the lid, a puff of fine black powder escapes, settling on your hands like evidence of wrongdoing. Soot, the master says, the ghost of fire. It gives ink its shadow. He gestures toward the small iron stove in the corner, its pipe snaking up toward the ceiling. If we run out, we make more by holding a plate over a flame. Simple, but messy. Much like life, You grin despite yourself. Is that why the walls are black, sir? He squints at you, but there's amusement in his eyes. No. That's why the students' faces are. The vinegar comes next, sharp, almost cruel in scent. You uncork the bottle and nearly recoil. The master chuckles. Good. If it doesn't sting, it's gone weak. He explains that vinegar helps extract tannins from the galls and preserves the mixture. The Victorians, he says, used every kind imaginable, apple cider, malt, even the dregs from pickling jars. Some recipes claim to last decades, others ate straight through paper. Historians still argue which was worse, fading ink or holes in your ledger. You make a mental note not to drink anything the master brings to class. The final ingredient, gum arabic, waits in a small cloth bag. When you untie it, you find amber-colored crystals, translucent and oddly beautiful. They catch the morning light like tiny drops of frozen honey. The master tips one into his palm and lets it roll across his fingers. Sap from the acacia tree, he says softly, almost reverently. Traded across deserts, worth more than gold in some places. Without it, the ink would flake and crumble. You pinch a bit between your fingers, it's tacky, faintly sweet. You imagine someone, somewhere, standing beneath a blazing African sun, cutting strips of bark and gathering the sap as it hardens. The world suddenly feels larger than this cold room. Never forget, the master murmurs, every drop of ink has a story before it reaches your page. You nod, trying to picture how many hands, how many journeys, went into this one morning's lesson. Once everyone has their supplies, the classroom buzzes with quiet excitement. The girls compare the size of their oak galls. The boys, predictably, see if they can bounce them. The master claps his hands, restoring order. Ink making, he says, is not play. It is precision. He divides the room into small groups, each tasked with preparing their ingredients. You crush the oak galls with the mortar and pestle, the grinding sound filling the air. The smell of damp wood and tannin rises, oddly soothing. Your classmates murmur softly, their voices blending with the rhythmic scrape of stone. A few desks away, someone sneezes dramatically, oak dust, probably, and mutters, "Bless me and curse the wasp." You can't help but laugh. As the day stretches on, you begin to notice details you'd missed before. The faint etching on the mortar, perhaps initials from some long-gone student. The slow, patient movements of the master as he checks each group's progress. The way sunlight fades to amber through the window glass. There's something hypnotic about the process, as if grinding, measuring, and mixing are all forms of meditation. The master moves behind you again, silent as dust. "Steady," he says. "Too fine a powder, and your ink will sour before the week's end." You ease up, adjusting the pressure. He nods approvingly. "Good. You learn by ear as much as by eye. Ink has a sound when it's right, listen for it." You lean closer to the bowl, and for a moment, you swear you can hear it, a soft, papery whisper beneath the scrape of stone. By late afternoon, your hands are stained and sore, but your basket is full of promise. The air hums with quiet triumph. The master stands at the front, arms folded, surveying his ink-streaked apprentices. "Tomorrow," he says, "we blend. Tonight, we rest." You look down at your hands, streaked with brown dust and black smudges. The scent of vinegar clings to your cuffs. You realize, with a small jolt, that this mess, is the beginning of something lasting. And as the bell rings and your classmates shuffle out, you linger by the window, watching fog roll over the rooftops. Somewhere beyond it, oak trees stand tall and unbothered, growing their secret galls. You smile at the thought, a forest quietly preparing tomorrow's lesson. The next morning, The classroom hums with a kind of restrained anticipation. The air smells faintly of damp woolen smoke, as if the building itself has woken reluctantly from sleep. You slide into your seat, feeling the chill of the desk through your sleeves. Before you lies the mortar and pestle, heavy as duty itself, waiting for your hands to finish what yesterday began. The master stands at the front, his waistcoat buttoned to perfection, spectacles gleaming. "Today," he declares, "you shall grind the oak's memory into submission." You suppress a smile. He could make even the simplest task sound like an act of divine importance. "Your goal is not destruction," he continues, pacing between the rows. "It is transformation." You look down at the bowl before you. The oak galls, those tiny relics of tree and wasp warfare, sit waiting, as unassuming as pebbles. You pick one up. It's rough and oddly warm from the touch of your fingers. With a small sigh, you drop it into the mortar, lift the pestle, and begin to crush. The first crack is sharp, like breaking a secret open. A faint, woody smell rises, tangy and familiar, earth, tannin, and something faintly metallic. You fall into rhythm, twist, press, release. The sound fills the classroom, a chorus of low, satisfying crunches. There's something deeply human about it, this shared labor, the grind and the patience, the sense that every student is part of a greater pulse. The master glides between the desks, hands clasped behind his back. Slowly, he warns. Ink made in haste runs like gossip. The line earns a few quiet chuckles, even from the stoic boy 2 rows up. Your arms begin to ache, but the rhythm pulls you along. The finer the powder becomes, the more the scent deepens. Bitter, earthy, intoxicating in its way. You imagine monks in cold scriptoria grinding galls by candlelight, preparing to copy sacred texts with trembling hands. They probably complained less, you think. But then again, they didn't have algebra exams. At the next table, someone sneezes explosively, sending a small cloud of gall dust into the air. The master doesn't even flinch. "Bless you," he says evenly, and coasts the tree. The room ripples with laughter. Even he seems faintly amused, though, true to form, he hides it behind a stern sniff. He pauses beside your desk, inspecting your progress. He murmurs, dipping 2 fingers into your powder. He rubs them together, testing the fineness. Adequate. Perhaps even promising. It's the Victorian equivalent of wild praise. You beam a little too proudly, which he immediately punctures. But do remember, too much grinding releases bitterness. Like overthinking. You nod, chastened, though you can't help but think he's describing himself. He moves on to demonstrate the next step. From a small bottle, he pours a trickle of water, just enough to dampen the gall powder. "Observe," he says, stirring with deliberate precision, "how the color blooms like old secrets." The pale beige turns to a soft brown, deepening as it mixes. The scent of wet oak fills the air, rich and strange. You try it yourself. The paste forms beneath your pestle, smooth and glossy. It looks almost edible, like a misbehaving pudding, but the smell warns otherwise. You scrape the mixture into a small ceramic dish, your hands trembling just enough to leave streaks on the rim. "Good," the master says, nodding. "Now comes the patience." He gestures toward the stove at the far end of the room. "We heat it gently. Not boil, never boil. The ink must learn calmness, as must you." The stove crackles softly, a small pot balanced over its flame. You take turns with your classmates, placing your dish near the warmth. The air grows thick with steam and the faint tang of vinegar from other mixtures nearby. Someone jokes that the room smells like a salad gone philosophical. The master ignores it, but you see the corner of his mouth twitch. As your mixture warms, A slow alchemy unfolds. The once muddy paste begins to darken, taking on the hue of roasted chestnuts. Tiny bubbles form at the edges, each one bursting with a soft hiss. You lean closer, mesmerized. It's strangely beautiful, like watching time condense. The master watches too, voice low now. You see, children, this is the heart of ink, the conversation between heat and patience. He explains that this gentle warming helps release tannic acid, the vital ingredient that will later bind with iron to create permanence. Ink that rushes to be born, he says, dies before it dries. There's poetry in his precision, though you suspect he'd never admit it. As the minutes pass, the classroom grows quieter, save for the occasional scrape of a spoon or the hiss of steam. The world beyond the windows fades into fog. You find yourself drifting, lulled by the rhythm of the process. There's something deeply soothing in the repetition. Measure, stir, wait. In another age, this could almost be prayer. The girl beside you hums softly under her breath. It's an old folk tune, something about sailors and storms. You join in for a verse before realizing the master is staring. Music, he says dryly, is rarely an ingredient in ink. But we shall see what it adds. A few students snicker. He lets the moment hang, then smiles faintly. Continue. The mixture thickens slightly, its color deepening toward mahogany. When it's ready, the master signals for everyone to remove their dishes from the heat. He moves down the line, inspecting each one like a general before battle. Some too pale, some too dark. But that, he says, is the nature of ink and humanity. He launches briefly into a tangent about old recipes. Some scribes, he says, added wine to their ink for smoothness. Others used beer. One misguided chemist in 1834 even tried brandy, claiming it improved moral character. Historians still argue whether that was an experiment or an excuse. The class laughs. You imagine monks slightly tipsy, slurring their way through scripture, and can't help but grin. By day's end, the bowls of brown paste cool on each desk, each one a small universe of potential words. The master dismisses the class with a simple instruction: cover your work. Tomorrow, we test its strength. You linger again, as you always do, running a finger around the rim of your dish. The surface gleams faintly in the lamplight. You wonder what stories it will tell, what names it will sign, what confessions it might record. As the lamps are snuffed and the room sinks into shadow, you hear the faint creak of the master's chair. Ink, he says softly to no one in particular, reminds us that even the quietest labor can stain the world. You slip out into the twilight, the scent of oak and smoke clinging to your sleeves, and for a moment, the whole foggy street feels like a blank page waiting for your hand. The morning arrives soft and gray again, but there's a warmth humming under your skin. Today you'll actually stir the ink, turning all the ground and gathered things into something living. The master calls it the discipline of patience, which, judging by his face, is a quality he worships but rarely practices. The classroom smells richer than usual, wood smoke, vinegar, and something darkly sweet. On each desk sits a glass beaker filled halfway with water, a set of small iron shavings, and the bowls of oak gall paste you made yesterday. The mixture has dried slightly overnight, forming a skin you'll soon break. It looks unpromising, like old porridge, but the master insists that beauty hides best in the boring. He raps the desk with his knuckle. Today we combine nature and artifice, he says. Steel and sap. Time and temper. You glance at the iron shavings. They catch the light like tiny stars, industrial stardust destined for darkness. You begin as instructed, a spoonful of oak gall paste into the beaker, a measured drizzle of water. You stir with the glass rod, watching the paste dissolve slowly, reluctantly. The water clouds, then clears, turning the color of weak tea. Good, says the master. Now add the vitriol. He means the iron sulfate, the heart of the reaction. You sprinkle the gray powder in, grain by grain. Instantly, the liquid shifts. Pale brown deepens to blue-gray, then to a shadowy purple that seems to breathe on its own. The class murmurs in awe. You hold your beaker closer to the light, mesmerized. It's alive, this ink. The master smiles faintly. You see? The oak gives tannin, the iron gives permanence. Together, they make memory. He lowers his voice conspiratorially. Some say the reaction continues for years after the ink is bottled. That's why old manuscripts grow darker with age, like wine or secrets. Historians still argue whether that's poetic exaggeration or solid chemistry, but the romance of it settles into you all the same. You picture some distant writer, their words growing bolder long after their hand has gone cold. There's something deliciously haunting about that. You keep stirring, feeling the resistance change. The liquid thickens slightly, its color deepening into the unmistakable darkness of ink. Your classmates whisper comparisons, like midnight tea, says one. Like storm water, says another. You mutter, like the master's mood. The nearest boy snorts into his sleeve. The master glances over. Care to repeat that, Mr. Witt? He asks smoothly. You freeze, pretending concentration. He lets the silence hang just long enough for you to sweat, then continues, voice soft. Ink remembers what we say around it, you know. It holds grudges. The class laughs. You exhale. One joke too far, but still intact. As the mixing continues, the room fills with a metallic tang, iron meeting tannin, history meeting chemistry. The master explains that this is the step where balance matters most. Too much vitriol, he warns, and your ink will corrode your pen and your patience. He gestures toward a small pile of ruined quills as proof. Too little, and your writing fades before your ideas have time to offend anyone. You try to imagine all the letters that vanished prematurely because someone was careless at this stage. Half-love confessions, unfiled tax receipts, unwritten revolutions. It makes the slow stirring feel sacred. When he's satisfied that everyone has achieved a respectable consistency, the master introduces the final element of the day's lesson, time. Now, he says, you must let the ink rest. The reaction needs to settle. Do not rush it. Do not prod it. You will watch patience happen. He sets an hourglass on his desk and flips it. The sand begins its slow, indifferent descent. The entire class groans softly. Yes, he says, smiling grimly. Exactly that feeling. Welcome to education. So you wait. You watch tiny bubbles rise and vanish. The master walks the aisles like a sentry guarding stillness. He occasionally stops to adjust a lamp or peer through a beaker as though checking for signs of moral weakness. You start to notice patterns in the swirling ink, tiny galaxies, constellations of tannin. You half expect to see your own reflection peering back, a ghostly figure made of soot and discipline. To pass the time, the girl beside you whispers a story. Her older brother once told her that Victorian ink factories sometimes hired children to stir huge vats by hand for hours on end. They called it stirring the storm, she says. Their arms would ache for days, but the ink came out perfect. You shiver a little, not sure if you believe her. Historians still argue whether that's myth or cruel reality, but it sounds exactly like something the Victorians would do. The master, perhaps overhearing, comments dryly, "Pain is an excellent teacher, though less so for handwriting." At last, the final grains of sand fall. He gestures grandly. Pour a drop on parchment. You do. It lands pale, almost invisible, and then, slowly, impossibly, it darkens, spreading like night seeping through snow. The transformation is silent but dramatic, the kind of thing that would have made you gasp if you weren't half afraid of looking childish. Instead, you just whisper, "It's alive." The master nods. That is oxidation. Air and iron shaking hands. Words will now outlive breath. He wipes his fingers on a cloth, leaving faint black smudges behind. "Remember this moment," he says. "This is what permanence feels like before it fades." The class stays strangely quiet, everyone watching their own droplets darken. The world beyond the windows seems distant, unreal. You can almost hear the paper sighing under the ink's slow invasion. Then, inevitably, someone sneezes, breaking the spell. The master clears his throat. "Bless you. And may your next sneeze be less dramatic." Laughter ripples across the room, the tension dissolving like sugar in tea. When the bell finally rings, you're reluctant to leave. You pack your things slowly, glancing back at your beaker one last time. It sits there on the desk, perfectly ordinary now, except that you know better. Inside it swells the power to write kings into law, lovers into legend, and children into history homework. As you walk home through the drizzle, you can't stop glancing at your fingertips, stained, faintly metallic, as though you've borrowed a bit of yesterday's alchemy. You rub them together, half expecting sparks. And maybe, just maybe, you feel a little wiser than when you woke. When you arrive the next morning, the air in the classroom feels charged, like the space itself remembers yesterday's experiment. Rows of beakers gleam faintly in the pale light, each holding that strange, restless liquid that seems to deepen in color even as you look at it. The master stands at the front, hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. "Today," he says, "you'll learn the nature of permanence, and how it betrays itself." He gestures for everyone to hold up their ink bottles. You do so carefully, the glass cool against your skin. The ink is no longer merely dark, it's something deeper, almost bottomless, like staring into the shadow of thought itself. "Iron gall," he says reverently. "The ink that wrote the British Empire, the ink of clerks and kings alike. Entire worlds signed into being by this blackness." You swirl your bottle and catch the faint scent of vinegar and rust. It's oddly comforting, though slightly nauseating if you linger too long. You imagine the countless hands that have done the same motion before, scribes, accountants, maybe even a lovesick poet pretending he's not covered in soot. The master begins the day's demonstration. He uncorks a fresh vial and pours a few drops into a shallow dish, then adds a pinch of something silvery. The mixture fizzes slightly, darkening even more. "Observe," he says. "Oxidation continuing before your eyes. A marriage of nature and intention. Once, the Romans used similar methods with soot and wine, but we, being sensible Victorians, prefer iron and acid." A boy at the back mutters, "And headaches." The master's ear twitches. "Yes, Mr. Wiggins," he replies, "and headaches. Civilization always comes with fumes." You chuckle under your breath. He passes around a magnifying lens, and when it's your turn, you peer closely into the dish. The ink's surface looks alive, tiny swirling eddies, specks of iron suspended in motion. The effect is hypnotic. It's as if you're watching the birth of midnight. "Now," the master says softly, "each of you will create your own portion. But remember, control is the soul of craft." You pour carefully. The reaction begins instantly, color blooming from gray to indigo to that familiar, consuming black. The class collectively gasps as if witnessing a trick of magic. One boy drops his beaker in surprise. It shatters, spraying black arcs across the floor. The master sighs and mutters something about the price of wonder. You stir your mixture slowly. The sound of glass against wood fills the room like an orchestra of tiny storms. As the reaction steadies, the master launches into one of his meandering lectures, the kind that drifts between history and philosophy. Iron gall ink, he explains, was favored by Leonardo da Vinci, used by Isaac Newton, and found in the margins of Shakespeare's drafts. Yet the same ink also ate through parchment and destroyed priceless manuscripts. Progress, it seems, always comes with teeth. He pauses, letting the class absorb that. You feel a small chill crawl up your arms. You imagine the nib of a quill etching words of genius that slowly dissolve the very paper meant to preserve them. The irony is too perfect, like time itself conspiring to edit humanity. Historians still argue whether the Victorians fully understood the corrosive nature of their beloved ink, or if they simply didn't care. Some say it was a metaphor for their age, beauty achieved through damage. You test your mixture on a scrap of paper. The droplet goes on pale, almost watery, but within seconds it blackens, biting into the fibers. You can smell it faintly, iron and decay, an aroma that could almost be nostalgia if you squint your soul the right way. The master leans over your shoulder. Good, he says, approvingly. Yours bites deeply. That means it will last. He doesn't mean the paper. He means the lesson. As he moves on, you catch your reflection in the inkwell, your face warped by darkness, eyes ghostly pale. It's unsettling, but oddly thrilling too. You realize that this black fluid holds something far older than empire or education. The human desire to leave a mark, to whisper across centuries, to say I was here. The room hums softly with concentration. Occasionally, a clink or a muttered curse breaks the stillness. Someone sneezes again, predictably. The master murmurs, "Bless you," and your ancestors' spelling errors. You laugh quietly. As the ink cools, you notice small flecks forming on the surface, tiny metallic motes catching the light. You poke one with your glass rod. It sinks slowly, leaving a brief trail like a comet across the night. You imagine that's what ideas look like before they land on paper. Bright for a second, then gone. The girl beside you nudges your elbow. They say this kind of ink was used to write secret letters during wars, she whispers. Invisible until heated. You raise an eyebrow. You sure you're not thinking of lemon juice? She grins. Maybe. But wouldn't it be wonderful if this stuff carried messages even it doesn't know about? You smile. Maybe it does. Maybe ink always hides a little too much. By the time the bell tolls, your fingers are dark again, stained as though you've shaken hands with shadow. The master gives his closing remark, tone half sermon, half lullaby. Remember, children, ink is only as honest as the hand that wields it. Treat it kindly, and it may just forgive your spelling. The class erupts in soft laughter, the kind that feels like relief. You pack away your bottle, careful not to spill a drop. Outside, the day has turned bright, the sunlight glinting off the bottle's neck. The ink inside looks bottomless, a captive storm. You imagine it whispering stories to itself, equations, poems, unfinished dreams, all waiting for a quill sharp enough to give them voice. As you walk, you can't help wondering what your first written word with it will be. A name, perhaps. Or maybe something simpler, begin. After all, that's what ink is for, turning beginnings into something worth remembering. When you return the next morning, your seat smells faintly of iron and sap. The air is thick with the ghost of yesterday's experiments, tangy, sweet, and strangely comforting, like a memory of burnt sugar and rain. On each desk now rests a new jar, sealed with wax and labeled gum arabic. The name alone sounds like a spell. Today, the master begins, we give the ink its tongue. He walks between the desks, coat brushing past you, trailing a scent of old books and ambition. Without gum arabic, your ink is like an unruly child. It stains everything it touches and refuses to behave. With it, the ink learns grace. You lift the jar and tilt it. The liquid inside moves sluggishly, golden and viscous, like melted honey. When you open it, the smell surprises you, woodsy, faintly floral, and unmistakably ancient. The master explains it comes from the hardened sap of the acacia tree, bled and dried in the heat of northern Africa before finding its way into British classrooms and ledgers. He dips a thin glass rod into his jar and holds it up, letting the thick thread of gum stretch and break. This, he says, is civilization in syrup form. You stifle a laugh, imagining the world's progress bottled like treacle. You spoon a little into your ink mixture. It clings to the metal like reluctant tar. The master's voice softens as he instructs. Mix gently. Let it coax the chaos into calm. You obey, stirring until the ink thickens, glossy now, its movements slower and more deliberate. It feels oddly satisfying, like teaching a storm to purr. As you work, the master tells a story. When explorers first brought gum arabic to Europe, he says, it was hailed as miraculous. Painters used it to bind color. Apothecaries sold it as medicine. Some Victorians even ate it, believing it improved digestion and complexion. The class murmurs, half fascinated, half disgusted. He continues, of course, it also glued countless tongues together, literally. You see, our ancestors tested everything by taste. He smiles faintly. Historians still argue whether that habit advanced science or simply reduced the population of fools. The girl next to you raises an eyebrow. So it's edible, she whispers. You shrug. If you want your breakfast to double as stationery. The master catches your whisper but pretends not to. His eyes twinkle, just for a heartbeat. The gum and ink blend perfectly now. The transformation is subtle yet profound. The mixture has gone from watery restlessness to a fluid steadiness, as though it has learned manners. You dip your finger in and lift it carefully. The ink clings, forming a smooth, glistening line before slipping away. It's oddly sensual, like the texture of wet silk. See, says the master. Control. Balance. Every masterpiece begins with a medium that obeys. He tells you to test it. You dip your quill and write a single word on the parchment. Patience. The strokes shine wetly before settling into matte perfection. No spreading, no bleeding. Just a quiet, flawless black. You can't help grinning. The master notices. Satisfaction, he says dryly, is the enemy of improvement. You groan. He smirks. But perhaps today, I'll allow it. As he moves on, you let your quill dance again, trying loops and flourishes. Each motion feels smoother than before. You even manage a small doodle, a crooked bird perched on a letter T. It looks ridiculous but charming, like something that wants to escape the page. The boy beside you notices. Looks like it's waiting for a worm, he whispers. Or freedom, you reply. He nods, solemnly. Same thing, most days. The master calls for attention. Now, he says, remember that gum arabic is alive. Too little, and your ink becomes unruly. Too much, and it never dries. He leans closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially. There's a lesson there, though I'll let you decide which part applies to people. You stare again, half to hide your smile. Then he gives you the part you've been dreading. Clean your brushes and jars, he says. Properly. A collective groan rises. Victorian discipline extends even to housekeeping. You fetch the basin of tepid water from the back of the room. The water turns faintly blue as the residue of ink dissolves, ribbons of color swirling like smoke underwater. You scrub, and scrub. And somewhere in the middle of your grumbling, something strange happens. The repetition becomes soothing. Each swirl of your brush feels like erasing the noise of the day. The water, though dark, begins to shimmer in the light. Everything worth writing, the master says softly behind you, comes from knowing when to clean the slate. He doesn't mean the jar. You know that now. You pour the darkened water out into the bucket by the stove. The last of it swirls down the drain like a tiny galaxy fading into oblivion. You watch it go, oddly wistful, as though you've just said goodbye to a thought you hadn't yet written down. The class is quiet again. The gum arabic scent lingers in the air, sweet, earthy, alive. You can taste it faintly when you breathe. The master returns to the front and claps his hands once. Tomorrow, he announces, you'll bottle your work. The ink will cease being a class project and become your own companion. Choose your glass wisely. There's a murmur of excitement. Ownership, finally. As you pack up, you notice your fingertips still tacky with gum. You rub them together absently and feel the pull, the delicate stickiness of connection. You imagine that if you pressed your fingers to the desk, you'd leave behind not fingerprints, but faint lines of thought. You walk home in the cool afternoon, your hands still slightly scented with resin and rust. The breeze seems gentler today, the sky washed pale blue. You think about all the invisible hands that once stirred, poured, and wrote before you. Centuries of students, clerks, dreamers, each of them leaving their quiet ink trails across time. And for the first time, you realize you're part of that line too. The day dawns bright and brittle, sunlight spilling across the desks like poured gold. There's a faint glimmer on every bottle and beaker, as though the ink itself has been waiting for this. The master stands at the front, sleeves rolled up, a dangerous omen. Today, he announces, you will bottle your creation. If you spill a drop, remember, gravity is not your friend. The class titters nervously. On each table sits an array of small glass vials, corks lined like soldiers, and scraps of muslin for filtering. It feels ceremonial, almost holy. You half expect church bells. You pick up a vial and hold it to the light. It's delicate, almost too much so. The glass ripples slightly, imperfect in that beautiful, handmade way that says someone cared enough to be flawed. The master walks among you, carrying a wooden tray filled with funnels. He sets one down before you and says, pour slowly. Ink rewards patience and punishes enthusiasm. You grin at that, because you've met both kinds of students in this room, and you're still not sure which you are. You uncork your jar and stir the ink once more. It gleams, thick and luxurious, like melted obsidian. When you bring it close, you smell iron, wood, and a faint sweetness, the ghost of gum arabic still whispering through it. You line the funnel with muslin, as instructed. The fabric trembles slightly as the first drops fall, staining it immediately, spreading into starbursts of black. It's mesmerizing. You can't help thinking of how many stories began exactly this way, with someone, somewhere, just pouring potential into a bottle. The liquid moves slowly, deliberate as thought itself. The funnel hums faintly, a wet whispering sound that makes the whole process feel alive. Do not rush, says the master, pacing behind you. Ink must breathe before it serves. One student sighs audibly, which earns them a sharp glance. You smile to yourself. You're learning the rhythm now, the pulse of patience, the poetry of small motions done right. Finally, your vial fills. You lift it carefully, cork it tight, and seal the neck with wax. The master hands you a stick of red wax for marking ownership. You melt it over the flame, watching the drip and pool before pressing your thumbnail into it. It's crude, but yours. There, the master says. Now your ink has a name, even if it refuses to tell anyone. You roll the bottle in your palm, feeling its warmth. Inside, the ink shifts and shimmers, as though it knows it's been caged. The room smells of resin and warmth. Sunlight filters through the windows, catching the faint dust in the air. Tiny particles drifting, settling, disappearing again. The whole classroom feels like a snow globe of history in motion. The master gestures toward a long shelf at the back. Set your bottles there. They must rest before use. Ink matures best when ignored. You walk carefully, bottle balanced between your fingers like treasure. One misstep, one stumble, and your entire creation could splatter across the floor, an instant tragedy of ambition. You hold your breath until you've placed it among the others. Dozens of vials gleam back, each slightly different in hue, as though reflecting the soul of its maker. You stand there for a moment, oddly proud. Remember, the master says quietly from behind, bottling is not the end. It is the beginning of preservation. Everything that matters, ink, ideas, even people, needs a container. Some hold better than others. You nod, not sure if he's talking to you or to himself. While the ink rests, he lets the class sketch. You dip into old habits, drawing the shelves, the glass vials, the streaks of light. But your mind keeps circling back to the idea of containment. You wonder how much of history was bottled like this, controlled, filtered, sealed, until someone decided it was ready to spill again. The boy next to you interrupts your thoughts by poking your shoulder. Mine looks darker than yours, he brags. You glance over, it's true. His ink gleams with a blue-black sheen, almost mirror-like. Maybe yours is overcooked, you tease. He frowns, holding it up. Or maybe yours is just shy. The master overhears and chuckles, a rare sound. There's no such thing as perfect ink, he says. Only ink that suits the hand. History is full of smudges, and we call that progress. That earns another ripple of laughter. As the afternoon drifts on, the room grows quieter. The fire crackles gently. Somewhere outside, a cart rattles over cobblestones. You rest your chin on your hand, watching the ink bottles like sleeping creatures. There's something hypnotic about them, tiny black oceans contained within glass horizons. You imagine them decades from now, sitting forgotten on a shelf, gathering dust. Someone might find them, uncork one, and still catch a faint whiff of gum and iron, the echo of today. Historians still argue whether Victorian ink could truly last centuries or if most of it turned to dust within decades. You prefer to believe the former. The idea that something you mixed with your own hands might survive longer than you feels strangely comforting. The master calls time, his voice softer now. Collect your things, he says. Leave the bottles to dream. You rise, the sunlight now golden and low, throwing long shadows across the room. As you pass your resting vial, you touch it gently with your fingertip. It's cool, still, yet somehow full of promise. You whisper, without quite meaning to, don't leak. You swear the glass gives a tiny, conspiratorial plink in reply. Walking home, you carry the faint smell of ink on your clothes, the tang of iron in your nails. The streets hum with evening life, carriages, shouts, laughter, but your thoughts stay bottled with that dark liquid on the shelf. You realize something as the gas lamps flicker to life. Making ink wasn't just about writing. It was about waiting. About learning to sit quietly until the world reveals what it means. And maybe, you think with a sleepy smile, that's a lesson worth spilling once in a while. The morning fog still clings to the windows when you step into the classroom again, the light dim and grainy as if the sun itself were hesitating. On each desk now lies a single, untrimmed goose feather, pale, curved, and faintly greasy. The faint scent of farmyard still clings to them, a reminder that even the instruments of learning begin with something that once had wings. The master stands at the front, holding one delicately between his fingers. "Today," he says, "we give voice to the ink. The pen is nothing without a tongue, and that tongue is the quill." You sit, fascinated and slightly apprehensive. There's something both noble and ridiculous about a feather becoming a writing tool. It's like teaching a bird to recite poetry. He begins by explaining the basics. A quill must come from a mature bird, preferably goose, though swan and raven make finer ones. The shaft must be strong yet supple. Most important, left wing feathers for right-hand writers, and right wing for left-handers. Why? So the curve doesn't drag across the page. Simple physics, centuries before the term existed. You glance down at your feather and wonder which wing it came from. The tip points toward you like an accusation. The master demonstrates the preparation. He heats a small pot of sand on the stove, pouring it into a tin mug. "Before cutting," he says, "we cure the quill. This hardens the barrel and removes oils. A soft quill writes like a nervous child." He slides the feather into the warm sand, leaving only the tip exposed. The smell is faintly toasty, like bread that's thinking about burning. After a few minutes, he removes it and taps it against the desk. It sounds sharper now, a faint hollow ring. "Now," he says, picking up a penknife, "we carve." The blade flashes, slicing delicately through the shaft. The class collectively leans forward. He explains each step in rhythm with his cuts, trimming the nib's length, shaping the slit, smoothing the shoulders. His movements are steady, almost reverent. The feather, once awkward and wild, becomes something purposeful, transformed by patience and precision. "Writing," he says, "begins with violence and ends in beauty. Never forget that." You swallow. You're not sure whether to be inspired or slightly alarmed. Then it's your turn. The knife feels alien in your hand, too sharp, too intimate. You try to mimic his angle, trimming the tip carefully. The first cut is uneven, a bit of feather splinters off, fluttering onto your lap like a snowflake of failure. The boy beside you snickers. The master raises an eyebrow. "Remember, Mr. Wiggins, even the finest authors began with blunt instruments." You breathe slowly and try again. This time, the blade slides cleanly. The feather resists, then yields, and you feel a strange satisfaction in that little click of perfection. You blow away the shavings and hold up your creation. The slit gleams faintly in the morning light, your very first nib. "Good," says the master. "Test it." You dip it into the resting ink bottle. The feather trembles slightly, soaking up darkness along its hollow core. When you lift it out, a perfect bead of ink clings to the nib. You hold your breath, lower it to paper, and draw a line. It sings. Not literally, of course, but the sound, a whispering scratch, is the closest thing to music you've ever made in class. The ink flows smoothly, obediently. The quill glides, leaving a trail of glossy black that soon dries to matte memory. It feels like flying. You forget your classmates, the ticking clock, even the master's hawk-like stare. You draw loops, flourishes, letters that look like they've been waiting centuries to exist. When the nib catches and splatters a tiny blot, you don't even mind. It's your blot. Your mistake, honest and handmade. The master claps his hands softly. "Excellent," he says. "Now you know why men once wrote love letters and treaties with the same tools. They both required equal courage." He paces slowly, inspecting the work. Inks fade. Parchment tears. But a quill remembers the hand that held it. He picks up one of the discarded trimmings and twirls it between his fingers. "Did you know," he adds casually, "that some scholars claim quills were also used as secret weapons? Hollowed shafts filled with poison, disguised as pens." Historians still argue whether that's fact or fancy, but it makes for excellent bedtime reading. You grin. I'll stick to love letters, sir. Wise choice, he says. Ink stains wash off easier than guilt. The class laughs softly. As the lesson continues, the room fills with the quiet rhythm of scraping and sighing, the small, industrious noises of a dozen students carving their way into literacy. The smell of feathers, iron, and warm wax blends into something strangely pleasant. At one point, your quill splits slightly at the tip. The master shows you how to repair it, just a trim and a soft press of the blade. Everything worth using needs maintenance, he murmurs. Including you. You test it again. The line comes smoother this time, as if the quill has forgiven you. You think of how this process, harvesting, curing, cutting, testing, isn't so different from life itself. Mistakes, corrections, tiny victories written in black and breath. By the end of the lesson, your desk is covered in feather shavings and specks of ink. Your fingers are blotched again, but you hardly care. The master dismisses the class with a single phrase, guard your quills. They'll betray you if you don't treat them kindly. You tuck yours carefully into your satchel, wrapped in a bit of cloth. It feels less like a tool and more like a secret. Outside, the fog has lifted. The air smells clean, the sky pale blue. You pause on the steps, holding the quill up to the light. The sun catches the curve of the feather, and for a moment, it looks almost alive again, ready to take flight, just in a different way. You smile. Writing, you realize, isn't about capturing thought. It's about giving it wings. The next day dawns with the smell of something faintly acrid drifting down the corridor, iron, vinegar, and the unmistakable sharpness of something alchemical happening before breakfast. When you step into the classroom, the windows are cracked open, and faint tendrils of steam curl lazily in the air. The master is already at the front, sleeves rolled up, hovering over a small iron pot like a wizard who's misplaced his spellbook. Today, he explains, is for the soul of writing itself, the ink. Not the watery, lazy black of store-bought concoctions, but a true Victorian brew, one that bit into paper with conviction and smelled faintly of thunder. He gestures for everyone to gather around the demonstration table. There's a wooden board laid out with little piles of strange ingredients. Oak galls like shriveled marbles, lumps of ferrous sulfate, a jug of rainwater, and a small flask of vinegar. You recognize none of them except the vinegar, which seems the least magical of the bunch. The recipe, he says, is older than any of you. Oak gall ink, used by monks, kings, poets, and board clerks for over 1,000 years. Every letter you've ever admired, from Shakespeare's first draft to Queen Victoria's diary, likely began with this. He picks up an oak gall and rolls it between his fingers. These, he says, are the work of tiny wasps. They lay their eggs in oak leaves, and the tree, in its panic, grows this little tumor around them. A natural fortress. You lean in closer, both fascinated and slightly disgusted. Nature's handwriting, you think, formed by fear. The master crushes one gall gently under a mortar, releasing a faint woody aroma. Rich in tannic acid, he explains, which loves iron. When the two meet, they turn black, permanent, unrepentant, and deliciously dramatic. He pours the powdered gall into a jar, adds a few spoons of ferrous sulfate crystals, greenish-gray and glinting like something that should be handled with tongs, and then stirs in the rainwater. The mixture begins to darken slowly, shifting from pale brown to murky blue. A hiss escapes as he adds a dash of vinegar. Helps the reaction, he says. Also deters mold. Mold is the mortal enemy of ink, and frankly, of civilization. You can't tell if he's joking. Probably. Mostly. He motions for you to come forward. "Here," he says, handing you the long-handled spoon. "Keep it moving. Ink doesn't like to be ignored." You stir carefully. The mixture thickens slightly, the smell sharp but strangely pleasant, like old rain on metal roofs. Around you, your classmates whisper in awe. The transformation is subtle but mesmerizing, the slow, deepening bloom of color, like nightfall bottled in glass. Victorians, the master continues, often guarded their recipes like secrets. Some added wine, others a touch of sugar, even a drop of brandy. Ink could be personal, an extension of one's character. He smirks. Imagine if modern text smelled faintly of rum. You chuckle softly, picturing messages typed with the scent of rebellion. As you stir, he begins telling a story. There was once a scholar, Mr. Ashworth, who claimed he could make ink so black it would absorb light. He spent years refining it, boiling galls under moonlight, filtering through silk, adding crushed violets for fragrance. He died before revealing the formula. Historians still argue whether it ever existed or was just another Victorian myth to sell pamphlets. You love that phrase, historians still argue. It's a reminder that even experts bicker about the color of ink while the rest of the world just writes letters. After a while, the master pours a thin stream of the mixture onto a scrap of paper. It glistens dark gray for a heartbeat, then dries to a perfect, inky black, smooth, velvety, confident. "There," he says. "It's alive." You blink. Alive? He smiles faintly at your confusion. Ink breathes. It changes over days. Fresh ink starts pale, then darkens as it meets air and paper. You think it's done when it's dry, but it's still transforming under the surface. Like thoughts. You feel that in your chest. He pours the rest into small glass bottles, no labels, just corks, and hands one to each student. Yours feels warm still, pulsing faintly against your palm. You swear you can hear a faint fizz inside. As you sit back down, he instructs everyone to test their ink. "No sentences yet," he says. "Just strokes. Let the ink learn your hand." You dip your quill, still a bit stiff from yesterday's glory, and draw a line. The ink trails behind it like liquid night, settling with a subtle shimmer. You tilt the paper. It catches the light beautifully, like black silk stretched thin. There's a quiet rhythm in the room again. Scratch, dip, breathe, scratch. Occasionally someone curses softly when their quill sputters or drips too much. But even that feels right, like part of a grand symphony of imperfection. Halfway through, the master strolls by and murmurs, "You see? A pen without ink is a whisper. But ink without pen is a storm with no sky." You're not sure what it means, but it sounds poetic enough to remember. The room fills with that metallic, vinegary scent, strangely soothing now, as if your brain has decided it's the smell of progress. You catch yourself wondering how many letters, confessions, or decrees began with the same aroma centuries ago. Ink connects you across time, tiny chemical threads weaving through human thought. At one point, a classmate named Eliza dips her quill too deep and splashes ink across her sleeve. The black bloom spreads like spilled night. She gasps. The master sighs. "Well," he says, "consider that your first published work, Tragedy on Cotton." You all laugh. Even Eliza smiles faintly. By the end of the hour, your fingers are blackened again, nails tinted gray-blue, the faint smell of vinegar clinging to your skin. You hold your bottle close, oddly proud of it. You've made ink. Not just used it, made it. The master dismisses class with his usual, "Mind your quills, mind your minds." You tuck your bottle into your satchel like treasure. Outside, the light has softened, clouds lazily drifting over the spire tops. You can't resist uncorking the bottle once more, holding it up to the light. The ink inside swirls slowly, almost hypnotically, as if dreaming. You whisper to it, absurdly, "We're going to write something beautiful, you and I." It doesn't answer, but you could swear it listens. By the time the next lesson begins, the ink you brewed yesterday has matured. It no longer smells sharply of vinegar and iron. Now there's a mellow sweetness underneath, a faint whisper of oak. The master says this is the moment when ink learns to behave, which sounds suspiciously like how he describes most of you. The desks have been wiped down, but faint ghosts of black still linger in the grain of the wood, little fingerprints of former mistakes. On each desk, there's a square of parchment waiting, soft and uneven, a creamy yellow that seems to glow faintly under the gray morning light. Paper, he explains, is fine for practice. But parchment, that's for permanence. You run your fingers over it. It's smoother than you expect, yet has a faint give, almost alive. It is alive, the master says, catching your expression. Or was. Calfskin, scraped thin and stretched. The Victorians still used it for legal documents, royal decrees, and anything they didn't want time to erase. You blink, half impressed and half horrified. Writing on what used to be a baby cow feels simultaneously sacred and slightly barbaric. The master raises a hand. And so, we prepare it. Parchment may look ready, but it isn't. Oil still hides within the fibers, and ink will slip away like gossip if we don't treat it properly. He produces a small pouch and dusts its contents over the surface. It's chalk, powdery, bone white, faintly dry smelling. You watch as he rubs it gently in circular motions with a cloth. This absorbs the oils and gives the quill something to hold on to. A blank mind needs friction to think. Parchment is no different. The class murmurs softly, the rhythmic sound of chalk on hide filling the air. When you rub your own sheet, it squeaks faintly under your fingers. Once the chalking is done, he shows you how to smooth the surface with a small knife, scraping lightly to remove imperfections. The sound is delicate, almost soothing, like someone carving fog. Too much pressure, he warns, and you'll have a hole instead of a thought. You try, carefully, your blade trembling slightly. A faint curl of dust rises where you scrape, a pale ghost of the past turning into possibility. You exhale. You hadn't realized you were holding your breath. As you work, he begins talking, not lecturing, more like storytelling. In medieval scriptoria, monks spent hours just preparing parchment before ever touching ink. They said each sheet carried a soul, and the act of scraping it was a kind of absolution. Some even prayed as they worked. Others cursed, which worked nearly as well. You smile faintly. Which did you do, sir? He grins. Mostly cursed. The class laughs softly, the sound breaking the stillness of the morning. Once everyone has prepared their sheets, he instructs you to test a corner. You dip your quill into your bottle, lift it with care, and draw a small line. The ink takes differently on parchment, slower, more deliberate, like it wants to think about each stroke before committing. It dries to a rich, dark brown instead of black, almost organic in its warmth. See, the master says. The parchment breathes back. You're not writing on it, you're writing with it. That's the secret. You trace a small flourish, and for a second, the world narrows to the movement of your hand, the tiny sounds of quill on skin. There's something profoundly intimate about it. You're not just writing, you're conversing with history. A classmate, Thomas, raises a hand. Sir, is it true that some scribes used human skin for parchment? The room goes quiet. The master sighs softly. Ah, yes. Or, at least, so the rumors say. Anthropodermic bibliopegy, the practice of binding books or writing on human hide. Rare, but not entirely myth. Historians still argue whether certain infamous examples, like the Dance of Death folios, were real or macabre exaggerations. Either way, it tells you something about how far humans will go to make their words eternal. You shiver. Eternal suddenly feels less appealing. The master lets the silence sit for a moment, then softens his tone. But we're not in the business of horror here. We're in the business of memory. Every page you write on today is a promise, to time, to truth, to yourself. You nod. A promise. You like that. The exercise continues. You practice letters, long, looping strokes that catch at the ends. The ink behaves differently on this surface. Too much pressure, and it spreads into spider legs. Too little, and it breaks into dust. Balance, that's the trick. Writing is always balance. The master drifts between desks, murmuring advice. Tilt your wrist, not your arm. Breathe before the curve. Yes, yes, now it lives. His voice is low and rhythmic, like someone lulling a room of restless spirits to sleep. At one point, you catch him examining a piece of older parchment, edges browned, covered in looping script. He says it's from the early 1800s, the ink faded to sepia but still legible. That, he says softly, is the Victorian dream, words that outlive their writer. They didn't build skyscrapers, they built documents. You think about that as you write your name, watching the ink sink into the fibers, the letters glimmering faintly before drying. You imagine someone, centuries later, finding this, tracing the curves, wondering who you were. The thought feels both thrilling and unbearably small. When the bell finally rings, you sit back, flexing your ink-stained fingers. The parchment in front of you holds your clumsy practice strokes and one neat, careful signature. It's imperfect but real. You can feel the faint texture of the letters under your fingertips, the way the ink slightly raised the surface as it dried. The master passes behind you and pauses to glance at your work. He smiles, not one of those sharp, correcting smiles, but a small, approving one. You've begun to listen, he says simply. You're not sure whether he means to the lesson, the parchment, or yourself. But you nod anyway. As you pack up your tools, he calls out one last thought. Remember, ink marks parchment, but parchment marks time. Everything we make is a negotiation with forgetting. You pause at the door, glancing back. The desks, the chalk dust, the bottles of ink, they look less like tools now and more like relics. Each a small, fragile weapon against oblivion. You step outside into the crisp air, feeling as though your hands still hum faintly with creation. The quill tucked in your satchel feels heavier now, not from weight, but from purpose. The world beyond the classroom seems brighter, somehow sharper, as if the act of writing has peeled back a thin layer of dullness from your eyes. Every leaf, every shadow, feels inked in by something greater. And for once, you're content not just to observe the story, you're part of it, scratching your place into time with a sharpened feather and a bottle of night. The following morning feels almost theatrical. The classroom windows glow with soft amber light, and every object, quills, ink bottles, even the faintly scuffed desks, seems to shimmer as though the air itself has been steeped in sepia. You arrive early, expecting another round of disciplined penmanship, but the master has something else in store. On the front table rests a stack of blank envelopes, a jar of sealing wax, and a small brass stamp shaped like a lion's head. Today, he says, voice slow and deliberate, you will make something worth sending. You raise an eyebrow. Sending where, sir? He smiles, the kind of smile that hides 100 possible answers. That depends on how honest you're feeling. A ripple of laughter moves through the class, but the mood quickly settles into curiosity. Writing letters, the master explains, was an art form in the Victorian age, a social ritual bound by ink, etiquette, and a dash of poetry. Every letter was an act of courage, he says. Once sealed, you could never call the words back. Like spells spoken into history. He begins distributing the envelopes, each with faintly uneven edges, handmade paper soft beneath your fingertips. The fibers catch light like tiny veins, almost pulsing. He tells you they were crafted by apprentices at a nearby mill, a place where the sound of pulp and water never stops. Victorian correspondence was never casual, he continues. Letters were conversations with distance, often lasting months. Lovers courted, rivals quarreled, explorers bragged. A good letter could build a friendship, or end a reputation. You grin. Sounds like Twitter, but slower. A few classmates snicker. The master sighs, but you catch a ghost of a smile tugging at his mouth. Yes, he says, but infinitely more legible. You set your ink bottle carefully in the desk's groove and prepare your quill. The parchment from yesterday has been replaced by smooth cotton paper. It feels slicker, more civilized, though less soulful. You test a line, it flows fast, spreading in elegant strokes. Perfect for confession. The master instructs, no essays today. Write a letter you'll never send. You hesitate, the tip of the quill hovering over the paper. The phrase strikes you strangely. A letter you'll never send, what's the point? But the silence in the room urges honesty, so you let the thought settle. He moves among the desks, murmuring reminders about formality. Begin with the date, the salutation. Even in secrecy, etiquette prevails. You dip your quill again, the ink glimmering like a secret about to be spoken, and you begin. October 8, 1891. Dear future self. The words feel awkward at first, but soon the rhythm catches. You tell your future self about the smell of oak gall ink, about the way parchment hums faintly when you scrape it, about the moment you realized writing isn't about permanence but permission, to feel, to fail, to try again. You admit things you hadn't thought to say aloud, that sometimes the silence of the classroom feels heavier than the lessons, that you're not sure whether you're meant for words or if words are merely tolerating you. Your hand cramps a little, but you keep going. The ink flows more confidently, as if it knows where to lead you. When you finally pause, you realize several classmates have stopped writing and are simply watching their own words dry, hypnotized by what they've confessed. The master walks slowly between the rows, peering over shoulders, not reading, just observing. Good, he says quietly. Now you understand why the Victorians believed the pen had a conscience. You smile faintly. Does that mean it'll keep my secrets? Only if you let it, he replies, eyes twinkling. Once everyone finishes, he brings out the sealing wax. The scent fills the room, sweet, resinous, faintly smoky. He lights a taper and drips molten red wax onto the flap of your folded letter. It spreads like blood, thick and glossy. Quickly now, he says, pressing the brass seal down. The wax cools almost instantly, the lion's head emblem emerging in perfect relief. You can't help but run your thumb over it. It's warm still, a small sun caught in paper. He explains the ritual. A seal was both protection and identity. A broken seal meant betrayal. A missing one meant mystery. Victorians sometimes sealed letters with hair, even tears, tokens of sincerity. Historians still argue whether those tears ever meant what the senders claimed. You imagine a world where every emotion required melting wax to prove its truth. It's both beautiful and exhausting. As the lesson winds down, the room fills with the quiet crackle of cooling seals. The air smells of smoke, iron, and something achingly nostalgic. Everyone handles their letter differently. Some clutch it protectively, others slide it into pockets as if it might vanish. The master places his own sealed envelope on the desk. The wax is deep blue, stamped with a crest of crossed quills. "Every year," he says softly, "I write one. A letter I'll never send. When I retire, I'll burn them all. The ink deserves its rest." You ask, "Aren't you curious what they'd look like if you opened them?" He shakes his head. "No. The act of writing was the message. The rest is vanity." The class goes silent again, as if realizing that sometimes the process is the purpose. "As you pack up," he adds, "take your letters home. Don't read them again tonight. Words need to breathe before they mean what you think they mean." You slip yours between the pages of your exercise book. The wax leaves a faint circular impression on the next page, like a kiss pressed through time. Walking home, you think about all the invisible letters of the past, Victorian lovers who never heard back, explorers whose dispatches sank at sea, students who inked their hopes on parchment that crumbled long before modern eyes could read them. Each one, a whisper in the archive of silence. You pause by the school gate, watching the sky turn the same shade as drying ink, dusky, patient, endless. You wonder what your letter will think of you when you finally open it years from now. Will it forgive your clumsy handwriting, your uncertain heart? Or will it laugh, gently, like the master does when you spill ink on your cuffs? You smile to yourself, feeling oddly peaceful. Some messages don't need replies. Some just need to exist. And tonight, you'll sleep knowing that somewhere in your satchel, sealed in wax and secrecy, a little piece of your present is quietly waiting for your future to remember it. The following afternoon brings a subtle shift in the classroom's rhythm. The familiar scent of ink and chalk hangs in the air, but something new joins it, a faint sweetness, like warm sugar and candle smoke. On the master's desk stands a small tray filled with colored powders, tiny glass jars, and something that glints faintly in the sunlight. "Today," he says, "we give ink its vanity." The class perks up. You can tell everyone's had enough of black and brown. Even words, it seems, crave a touch of spectacle. The master lifts one of the jars. Tiny specks of gold dust shimmer inside, catching the light like captured stars. "The Victorians," he begins, "were as fond of embellishment as they were of rules. Letters, invitations, ledgers, all of it could be ornamented with color. But nothing said importance quite like a touch of gold." You lean forward. Gold ink. The idea feels luxurious, absurdly beautiful, and slightly impractical, exactly the kind of thing Victorians would adore. He gestures for the class to gather closer. "There are 3 paths to gilding," he explains. "Powder, shell gold, and leaf. We'll work with shell gold today, real gold ground to dust, mixed with honey and gum arabic until it behaves." He unscrews a small tin. Inside, a paste glows faintly, somewhere between sunlight and amber. The smell is faintly metallic, faintly sweet. "The honey keeps it soft," he says, "and the gum binds it to paper. Every stroke, a marriage of sweetness and permanence." You can't help but whisper, "So we're basically painting with dessert." He raises an eyebrow. "If dessert could bankrupt you, yes." The class chuckles softly. He demonstrates first, taking a fine brush rather than a quill. Gold doesn't flow like ink, it needs persuasion. With delicate care, he paints a small swirl onto parchment. At first, it looks dull, almost muddy. But as it dries, he tilts it toward the window, and suddenly it catches the light in a flash of brilliance. It looks alive. You hear someone gasp. Even the most skeptical students seem momentarily reverent. Gold, the master says, was never merely decoration. It was devotion. Monks gilded manuscripts not to impress but to reflect the divine. To remind readers that light itself could live on a page. He pauses, letting the shimmer speak for itself. Of course, he adds dryly, Victorians mostly used it to make their calling cards unbearable. You laugh softly, imagining some smug industrialist flashing his name in metallic script. When your turn comes, the brush feels impossibly delicate. You dip it lightly into the mixture and watch as the bristles turn to gold. The first stroke trembles, too thick, but as you steady your wrist, the line evens, gleaming faintly. The surface resists at first, but with each pass, it begins to glow more confidently, catching even the faintest glint of sunlight from the window. There's something mesmerizing about it. Each brushstroke feels like slow breathing, each curve a meditation. The classroom grows quiet except for the faint scratch of bristles and the occasional sigh of awe. The master moves among the desks, murmuring advice. Too little gum, and it flakes. Too much, and it dulls. Like people. You glance up. Does that mean we're all a bit gilded, sir? He smirks. Only the ones who think they aren't. He pauses to tell a story. In 1845, a printer named Wilton claimed he'd invented indestructible gold ink. He swore it would last 1,000 years. He even buried samples in his garden to prove it. When they were unearthed decades later, they'd turned green. Historians still argue whether that was science or irony. You grin. Probably both. The hour drifts by in that slow, honeyed way. You and your classmates fill your pages with spirals, letters, miniature suns. The air smells of candle flame, gum, and faint sweetness. Every desk glows faintly, as though the classroom itself has learned to breathe light. When your page is nearly full, you sit back and tilt it. The letters of your name gleam softly, caught between day and dusk. For a moment, you forget the world outside, the wet streets, the chill of autumn, the endless gray of everyday life. Inside this tiny kingdom of quills and bottles, you've made light obey you. The master claps his hands softly to get your attention. Now, remember, gold ink is vanity's twin. It looks eternal, but it cracks easily. Humility must underlie every stroke. He glances toward the open window. The late afternoon sun filters through dust motes, turning them briefly into floating flecks of gold. Still, he adds, beauty deserves its place in education. Even a signature can be a small rebellion against dullness. Someone asks if Victorians ever used other colors. He nods. Indeed, red from cochineal beetles, blue from lapis, green from verdigris. The empire had a habit of grinding its conquests into pigments. Some inks came from indigo plantations, others from crushed insects. Every color had a cost. You imagine a classroom full of those shades, the red of empire, the blue of oceans, the gold of ambition. Writing suddenly feels like an act of both creation and confession. The master lets everyone experiment freely for the last few minutes. Some paint initials, others try tiny flowers or patterns. You sketch a small sun at the corner of your parchment, each ray a deliberate stroke. It gleams faintly even as it dries, a quiet emblem of joy. When the bell rings, no one moves immediately. You're all transfixed by the pages before you, tiny galaxies of gold light resting on parchment. The master finally breaks the spell. Take them home, he says softly. But keep them safe. Gold attracts envy, and envy rarely washes out. You carefully slide your parchment into your notebook, careful not to smudge it. The gold catches the dim hallway light as you leave, reflecting just enough to follow you out the door. Outside, the sky itself seems to mimic the lesson. Burnished orange clouds stretching across the horizon, sunlight gilding the rooftops. You walk slower than usual, trying to memorize the shimmer of everything before it fades. For the first time, you think you understand the Victorians' obsession with making things shine. Maybe it wasn't about pride or grandeur. Maybe it was their way of refusing the grayness of life, their way of saying, "Look, there's still beauty here, even in the ink." You lift your hand, faintly dusted with gold, and let it catch the last light of the day. It glows for a moment, then dims, leaving only a whisper of warmth behind. Still, it's enough. By the next morning, the thrill of gilded ink has softened into something quieter, a lingering sense of reverence that clings to your fingers. The classroom feels slightly cooler today. Perhaps the rain has returned, or perhaps the glow from yesterday simply spoiled you. Either way, the lamps burn earlier than usual, casting pools of amber light over the wooden desks. Today, the master announces, we move from ornament to endurance. You can feel a ripple of unease pass through the class. Endurance sounds less glamorous than gold. But then he holds up a small, unassuming bottle. Its contents are thick, almost tar-like. This, he says, is iron gall ink, the backbone of Victorian writing, used in ledgers, letters, diaries, and treaties. If gold ink was vanity, this was commitment. You lean closer, catching a whiff of something sour, oak galls and iron, a metallic tang that prickles the back of your nose. It smells like regret, you mutter. The master nods approvingly. That's how you know it's authentic. He explains that the ink is made by combining crushed oak galls with iron sulfate, gum arabic, and a little water. The reaction darkens gradually, transforming from pale gray to deep black as it oxidizes on the page. The Victorians loved it, he says. They said it was like life itself, it darkened with age. You can't help but smirk. And flaked apart eventually. Exactly, he says. Just like their marriages. The class snickers softly, but there's truth beneath the humor. You've read enough history to know that the Victorians built their world on contradiction, elegant facades masking corrosive secrets. It's fitting that their favorite ink shared the same nature. Beautiful, useful, and slowly self-destructive. He pours a few drops of the viscous liquid into shallow glass dishes. The color is deceptive, a bluish gray that promises little. But when the first student tests it on parchment, the stroke begins to deepen immediately, like a bruise blooming beneath the surface. Within seconds, it turns a rich, velvety black. Magic, someone whispers. Chemistry, the master corrects, though his smile betrays a hint of wonder. The tannic acid from the oak reacts with the iron. That's why old manuscripts written in iron gall ink can last centuries, if they don't eat through the paper first. He pauses, letting that irony hang in the air. Historians still argue whether iron gall ink preserved more documents than it destroyed. You swirl your quill in the dish and begin to write. The ink feels alive beneath the nib, slightly grainy, slightly heavy. Each stroke darkens with time, as though the words themselves are deciding how bold to become. It's strangely satisfying, this slow reveal. You write a line, wait a few breaths, and watch the transformation. The letters deepen and solidify, as if sealing their own fate. Notice, the master says, how it bites into the fibers. That's not metaphorical, it literally corrodes its way in. When you write with iron gall ink, the page remembers you permanently. Even if the words fade, the impressions remain. There's something oddly comforting about that. The permanence, the quiet violence of it. Every sentence becomes both creation and wound. You imagine clerks in gaslit offices, scribbling late into the night with the same dark ink, every invoice, every confession, every secret binding itself to paper with invisible fire. The Victorians wrote as if permanence were a moral duty. The master's voice softens. They used it for everything. The Magna Carta's later copies, the diaries of explorers, even love letters. There's a famous story about a woman in 1863 who wept over her fiancé's letters until the tears reactivated the iron salts. His words bled across the page again, as if alive. Romantic, yes, but also terrifying. You grin faintly. So iron gall ink, haunted and high maintenance. Precisely, he says. Much like the Victorians themselves. The room falls into a focused hush as everyone practices, each student lost in the rhythm of writing. The scratching of quills sounds like rain on rooftops. Every so often, someone pauses to blow gently on the ink, watching it shift hues in the light. You find yourself tracing slow, looping letters, almost meditative. There's a strange pleasure in knowing that every word you write will outlast you, possibly centuries longer. It feels both humbling and egotistical. The master moves between desks, occasionally dipping his quill into someone's dish to test the consistency. If it's too acidic, he warns, it will burn through the page in time. The Victorians knew this, yet they used it anyway. They trusted their ink to outlive them. That was enough. He sets a small book on his desk, its pages browned, edges brittle. This, he says, is a Victorian copybook from 1872. Written entirely in iron gall ink. He opens it slowly, and the room leans in. The script inside is exquisite. Black, precise, unyielding. The ink still gleams faintly under the lamplight, though the paper around it is cracked, like old skin. It's eaten its way through in places, he murmurs, touching a hole where a letter used to be. Even beauty, when too strong, destroys its vessel. The metaphor sits heavily in the air. You stare at your own page, the deepening letters, the faint sheen of the wet strokes, and wonder what future historians might say about your handwriting if it survived that long. The master finally smiles again, breaking the somber mood. Still, he says, I'd rather something dangerous than something dull. Ink should have a little rebellion in it. A student at the back pipes up, so you're saying writing's basically controlled corrosion. He chuckles. Precisely. Civilization, too. By the time class ends, your hands are faintly stained, fingertips grayish-black. You try to wipe them on a cloth, but the marks cling stubbornly, as if the ink refuses to let go. It's a fitting memento of the day, proof that what you've made is meant to last. Outside, the sky hangs low and metallic, mirroring the ink's hue. The rain has begun again, tapping faintly on the window panes. You tuck your parchment into your satchel carefully, imagining how it might look in 100 years, faded, perhaps, but still legible. As you step into the drizzle, the smell of iron and oak seems to follow you. The world feels sharper somehow, more permanent, as if every puddle, every street, every breath carries its own slow chemistry of change. You think about how fragile permanence really is, and how the Victorians, so proud of their progress, poured all their longing for eternity into bottles of black liquid. Maybe that's what ink has always been, the human attempt to hold still the passing of time. And as the rain darkens your coat, you can't help but smile. Perhaps, you think, the ink understands. The next morning begins differently. The rain has finally cleared, and the school smells of damp earth and coal smoke. When you walk into the classroom, the desks are neatly arranged, and every bottle of ink, black, blue, brown, and even a small jar of gold, is lined in perfect order along the window ledge. The sunlight filters through, catching faint glints on the glass, and for once, the room feels almost tranquil. The master stands at the front with a quiet smile. Today, he says, we finish our ink. You sense an ending in his tone, though he never says so directly. It's that gentle finality, the kind that makes you nostalgic for something that isn't over yet. He begins by handing out fresh sheets of parchment. You've mixed, ground, and written, he says softly. Now, you'll bind the lesson. One final page, your masterpiece, your record, your ink-made memory. The class rustles with a mix of excitement and melancholy. The kind of quiet chatter that happens before goodbyes. You uncork your bottle, the same one you've been using all week. The faint tang of iron, oak, and gum arabic still lingers. You shake it gently, as though waking something ancient from sleep. The master leans over your desk. Remember, he murmurs, writing is not about showing what you know, it's about revealing what you notice. You nod, and begin. The quill moves smoothly now, your wrist sure, the ink flowing with a familiar weight. The first line is clean, the letters evenly spaced. The process has become second nature. Dip, tap, glide, breathe. You no longer think about how much ink to take or how to angle the nib. It's muscle memory, quiet and rhythmic. As you write, the world seems to narrow to the tip of your quill. You can hear only faint sounds, the scratch of others writing, the occasional sigh, the rustle of paper. The light has grown softer, brushing the pages like silk. The master speaks quietly as he walks between desks. Victorian ink makers, he says, believed their recipes held souls. They guarded their formulas like secrets. Some even refused to pass them on, claiming only the truly patient deserved to know. Historians still argue whether that superstition was arrogance or reverence. You glance up at him. Do you believe ink has a soul, sir? He pauses, considers. Only when someone gives it one. It's the kind of answer that sits in your chest for a while before it makes sense. Your hand moves again, tracing a paragraph about the feeling of the ink, its texture, its faintly metallic scent, its tendency to darken as it dries. You add a small decorative border of curls, something you wouldn't have dared attempt on the first day. The lines shimmer faintly in the light, crisp and confident. Across the room, someone mutters that their quill has split, and the master chuckles. Ah, the quills protest, the surest sign of progress. You smile to yourself. There's comfort in the imperfections now, as though the ink and quill and hand have finally learned to tolerate one another. Halfway through the page, you pause and study your work. It's not flawless. The letters lean slightly, a small blot mars the margin, and the gold line you tried to add ripples unevenly. But it feels alive. Human. And that's enough. The master sets down a glass of water at his desk and looks around the room, his eyes soft. You've learned something that cannot be measured, he says. The Victorians taught discipline through ink, but what they really passed on was attention. Every drop, every letter, every breath while writing, it's a kind of prayer. You let his words settle as you finish your final line. The ink glistens for a moment, then sinks into the parchment, darkening to a steady, quiet black. You blow gently across the page, watching the last shimmer fade. When everyone has finished, the master gathers the bottles one by one. Look at your hands, he says. You do. Your fingertips are speckled with gray, faint traces of gold, smudges of brown. Little souvenirs of the week's labor. Permanent stains, he murmurs. Proof that what you learn doesn't wash off easily. The class laughs softly, though you sense everyone feels a bit sentimental. The air holds that peculiar calm that comes after a storm, the calm that feels like memory forming in real time. The master walks to the window and opens it slightly. The afternoon breeze carries in the scent of wet leaves and distant coal fires. Ink, he says, is civilization made liquid. It records us, betrays us, immortalizes us. It turns fleeting thought into matter. So treat it with gentleness. You glance down at your page again, and the words seem different now, not just shapes, but echoes. Each letter feels heavier, fuller, as if it contains not only meaning but the faint residue of every hand that's ever written before. When the final bell rings, no one moves for a moment. You're all sitting quietly, waiting, unwilling to disturb the stillness. The master simply nods once, a silent dismissal, and turns back to his desk. You pack your parchment carefully. It feels strange, knowing this will be the last ink you make here. You take one last look around, the wooden beams, the worn desks, the faint glimmer of drying ink catching the sun. The classroom smells of oak, paper, and warmth. As you step outside, the light is gold and forgiving. You walk slowly, the paper tucked beneath your arm, careful not to bend it. There's something comforting about the idea that this small sheet, born of galls and gum and patience, might outlast you. Maybe someday, someone will find it, faded, brittle, but still legible. Maybe they'll wonder who you were, and what you were thinking when you dipped your quill into that stubborn little bottle of ink. You like that thought. You like the quiet vanity of leaving something behind, even if it's just a page that smells faintly of iron and honey. And as you walk down the cobbled street, you realize that making ink wasn't just chemistry or craft. It was tenderness disguised as labor. It was time made visible. You breathe in the air, the faint tang of soot and spring mingling on your tongue, and smile. Somewhere behind you, the classroom window glints like a droplet of gold. The lesson is over. But the stain, as promised, remains. As the last of the ink dries, let the story fade softly in your mind. The room quiets. The air grows slow and warm again. You can almost hear the faint scratching of quills still echoing somewhere behind your eyelids, like the gentle patter of distant rain. You've followed every step, the grinding, the mixing, the patient waiting, the gleam of gold, the darkness of iron. You've stood in that classroom, hands stained and heart steady, watching ink turn from idea to permanence. There's something deeply human about that process, isn't there? Turning chaos into order, time into texture, thought into trace. Let that thought settle, low and quiet. Imagine the paper before you glowing faintly in the lamplight. Every mark on it deliberate, every imperfection forgiven. The smell of oak and gum still lingers in the air, a calm, woody sweetness that drifts towards sleep. You breathe in slowly, out slowly. Let your thoughts soften, your pulse ease. The classroom dims, the lamps blur, and the master's voice fades into something kind and far away. All that remains is the hush of parchment and the memory of your hand moving across it, steady and unhurried. The ink has dried. The lesson is written. The night, at last, is still. Sweet dreams.